Welcome to Lab, the podcast. We are uncovering enchanted reality through conversations with people whose lives and work give us a glimpse of the life and beauty of the gospel. We're so glad you're joining us for the conversation. Lab, the podcast starts right now. Hey, welcome to Lab, the podcast. Grateful today to be joined by author and thought leader, Dr. John Seel. John is a friend. He's a friend and partner to V3, and he's also been here before for a conversation on his book, The New Copernicans. Dr. Seel is a cultural analyst, a writer, a businessman, a consultant. He's the author of 5 books, including most recently Network Power, The Science of Making a Difference. He's currently writing Nature's Echo, The Suspicion of Spiritual Biomimicry, which that's coming out in 2024. He served as an adjunct faculty at Gordon Conwell Theological Seminary, Covenant Seminary, Palmer Theological Seminary, and currently the academic dean and professor at St. Andrews College in Chester, California. Long list of other things, John, but most importantly, just a good friend and somebody who we benefit from sharing life together with. How are you doing? Thanks for sharing some time with us.
I'm doing extremely well and very excited about this new chapter in my life.
Yeah. Well, it's literally, we were just talking, it is a new chapter. You had a pretty significant health scare not too long ago, and you're doing well. So I'm glad to see that. But you literally have a second chance now.
Yes, it's actually the second time in my life that I've been given a spiritual second chance. I had a traumatic brain injury in 2010, and it was pretty bad. And I was in the hospital for a long, long time. And they had no idea that I would make it back. They didn't know if I'd be able to speak again, drive again. It was very dicey. And God brought into my life at this Boston hospital a believing Korean Christian doctor who is like the all-time expert in the field of brain injuries. In fact, he's in charge of brain injuries for Walter Reed Hospital he is. But he asked me to come to his church to speak because he believes what happened in my life was miraculous.
Wow.
And so I came back from that and I thought, well, I've been given a new chance. And then about 4 months ago, I had a pretty significant heart attack. And the most significant part of it was I actually died twice, and they had to paddle me twice and revive me. So I literally died and came back. And now I have a completely clean bill of health. My heart is as good as it's ever been. And my cardiologist says I don't need to see you for another 6 months. And so I'm just very excited. But spiritually, I have realized that God has brought me back from death, and I have to use every day with a new kind of focus and purpose. And I will say quite candidly, since that event, my writing has changed, and I am writing with a lot more, I don't know, maybe the right word is sense of urgency and sense of we really need to make a difference now rather than wait and think that we have all the time in the world, that the moments are really pressing. And so I've been given whole new opportunities, and I've been writing on the change of our age, the fact that I think the crisis of masculinity is a huge one. And so I've just been given an opportunity and feel a very special empowerment of God since this event happened for this chapter in my life. And for that, I am both humbled and grateful.
Yeah, well, I can see the difference. I mean, we were talking before the heart attack incident, and then I watched you recover a little bit from that, and you look great. And so we're glad to see you're doing so much better. What a crazy thing to just try to digest the fact that you died twice and brought back and paddled and that whole experience. So the fact that we get to have these conversations, I'm reminded Cammie and I just went to New York and I got to see Hamilton in that line that says, "Why do you write like you're running out of time?" You know, and there's this urgency to the writing, and it's just,
Write that down. That's exactly me.
yeah, why do you write like you're running out of time? It's such a good line, but we're glad you're feeling better. Last time we talked, we were talking about Dr. Nancy Pearcey's book.
For sure.
She was on the podcast talking about The Toxic War on Masculinity, which is her new book. And you and I were having a conversation, and you actually know Dr. Pearcey, you're friends, and so you've got some personal history there. But you also share her concern about the moment men are in and what they're facing right now. And you reference her book in your piece that you wrote, The Triage and Cultural Engagement, the priority of addressing the crisis of masculinity. And that paper concludes with you saying this sentence. You say, men are in trouble, and it's a problem that can no longer be ignored. I think Dr. Pearcey did a great job kind of helping us understand the trouble men are in and how we got here. But as a cultural analyst, why do you believe that that's a problem that can no longer be ignored? I've caught that same sense of urgency in that line.
Well, it can't be ignored because men have a huge impact on the family as the basic social structure of society, and so as goes men, so goes democracy, so goes the family. And if we're interested in the transmission of faith from one generation to the next, the spiritual role of the father in the home has a disproportionately powerful impact. And what most people don't realize is that we have a crisis in America that's unique in the world for absent fathers. In other words, there are 3 times more fathers not in the home than in any other place in the world. Or put it this way, in most of the world, absent fathers is 7%. In the United States, it's 25%. And then obviously in certain communities, it's closer to 50%. And then we talk about drug problems, we talk about gun violence. The deeper issue for all of this host of social problems, which are real, is the father in the home and the spiritual life of the father. And as Nancy rightly points out, men don't know how to actually function today. In fact, the cultural narrative is that we have a women's gender problem and not a men's gender problem. And the fact of the matter is, the men are the ones in crisis, not women. And so we can't talk about the problem. And then when we do talk about the problem within many circles, the very notion of masculinity has been erased. It's not a distinction as a gender that we want to even make. And then when we do talk about it, we talk about it in terms of it being a negative or toxic. And sadly, some of the greatest sources of that language of toxicity of masculinity actually came from the church. That's what Nancy tries to address in her book. So it's no wonder that men feel, and I'm talking about young men, let's say 20s to 35 to 40, they feel really very much at sea. Increasingly, we have a lot of analysis. This is a big problem. We need to try to address this problem as a problem, and that we're not ignoring it from a social science perspective. But in almost all the books, there's very little being done at the deepest level in terms of solving the problem from a spiritual perspective. I mean, if you look at the problem deeply, men have a problem of meaninglessness. They don't have a sense of calling or purpose for their life that's overarching. They're operating in the gig economy, which just creates a whole level of stress and anxiety and lack of purpose. There is an epidemic of loneliness, particularly among men. Maybe the deepest source of so much of this frustration is loneliness. And then they have a sense of being impotent. In that sense, they have a feeling of being powerless over the direction of their life, not only in their careers, but in their relationships. And so nothing seems to be working. And in the areas of purpose, loneliness, empowerment, you would think those are all in the church's wheelhouse. And we should be having a lot to say in this regard. Sadly, men are turning instead to podcasts and to alt-right influencers that have very little to say from a biblical perspective. And so I'm trying to lean heavily into it to say, we have a crisis of identity. We don't know how to ground my sense of self and who I am in a manner that is secure. And the wider culture today believes that our identity is one that we design. It's a do-it-yourself project. And so everyone is basically in the business of trying to create the brand called me. And frankly, that's guaranteed to fail, and it's guaranteed to be wrong-headed.
Well, and it's exhausting.
Because the fact is, the first move is never in. The first move is always out. If you put a plant on your windowsill, the first thing the plant will do is orient itself to the sun. The first move is always out to the source of light, and all of nature is derived from sunlight. And then, of course, that's not enough. That plant has to take that sunlight and, through photosynthesis within it, transform it into energy. And even that's not enough, because that energy has to be so encapsulated in a way that it actually produces beauty in a flower, nourishment in a fruit, and legacy in a seed. That's what nature tells us. And we need to orient our lives and our identity in the same direction. It will be the same pattern, except we need to be people who are knowing how to derive our life from the resources of the kingdom of heaven in a direct relationship with Jesus Christ, and know how to translate that into our lives in such a way, embody it into our lives, such that we can produce in our lives some sense of beauty, some sense of nourishment, and some sense of legacy.
I think that's why, I mean, that's the book that you're writing. You're going to unpack that. So I can't wait for that to come out, because you're literally saying the heavens declare the glory of God. We see it. You can look around. The world is ordered and created in a particular way. Flourishing is downstream of a recalibration to that order. That's what our entire ministry is: vision up, vision in, vision out. You have to look to the source, Jesus. You have to look, and then you will look like him, and then you will look with him. You will be able to move from up to in to out. And that's what I was going to ask about. I think there's an upstream conversation about the crisis of masculinity, because it seems to me that the challenge is this greater loss and confusion around what it means to be a human, and that's been unmoored. We don't know what that means and the implications of that in our moment. I was just listening, Elon Musk was on Joe Rogan's podcast, and they just released this conversation that they were having. And Elon Musk is talking about our moment that we're living in with AI right now. And he believes that we're on the threshold of an artificial intelligence revolution. And I couldn't help but make the connection, because Nancy talks a lot about the crisis of masculinity downstream of the Industrial Revolution. And she says you can literally go back and plot this seismic shift that took place in what it was to be a man, what it was to be a father, what it was to have a home at the Industrial Revolution, and how that moved culture in a different way. And here I hear Elon Musk saying we're on the threshold of an artificial intelligence revolution. And he said that there is soon we will be interacting in a relational way with a being that we created that is more intelligent than us. And he's talking about artificial intelligence. We created it, we programmed it, but it's now superseded our intelligence, but not our embodiment. And so I, again, was thinking, oh, wow, what an interesting moment. That the question is, what does it mean to be a human? That's really the question people are asking. And so in order to get some grounding on what it means to be a man, we have to go upstream and say, that's actually the conversation that's on the table right now. Do you agree with that? Do you see that same challenge in the same way?
Well, as you know, I'm in the business of starting another company that's actually in the supercomputing AI space. So this is a conversation I spend a great deal of time thinking about.
I saw it in your bio, and I was going to ask you privately so I could get a jump on investing if that was an idea that I should be a part of. I'm just kidding. But I saw that, but I didn't mention it because I hadn't heard about it yet.
Well, until we get the VC capital, I don't talk about it too much. But the fact of the matter is, obviously, Elon is a very influential person in our time, very successful, and very utopian on technology, and also a transhumanist when it comes to worldview. So he, at this level, is a part of the technological undermining of what it means to be human. And I think that I think we need to back up and to go back to, in effect, a pre-modern, embodied, mystical understanding of our dependence on God in ways that we have lost sight of in a highly technological age. What AI is going to do is going to double down on a left brain, a left hemisphere way of thinking. And that will take us further away from where we need to be, which is to engage the right brain hemisphere and see things holistically. And so it is adding steroids to the problem in a way that is going to be tricky to navigate. Now, that doesn't mean that there aren't many benefits from using AI, but the way he's dealing with it, and if you really want to get into it, the next big jump is what is called quantum computing. Now, it's probably 30 years away, but the technology I'm working on is a bridge to quantum computing. So I'm right in the middle of this conversation. And will this have huge implications for us? Oh, absolutely. Did the internet have a big impact on American society? Yes. Social media? Yes. Printing press? Yes. Industrial revolution? Yes. Communications revolution? Yes. And who are the people who tend to be least discerning about some of these things? Christians tend to be very undiscerning. So we need to have our thinking caps on. And fortunately, we need to have kingdom-oriented people in these conversations at the highest level.
Yeah. Well,
and so we're trying to make that difference, in the company I'm working on. Company's name is Meditech AI, and I'm very excited about it, and we're very close to getting funding. So the point being is, I just think that we are in a moment where we really need to pay attention to some of the most pressing problems. And I framed my paper on masculinity in the context of triage. Triage, I'm a former emergency medical technician. I used to run with an ambulance squad. And a triage is when you have a multi-casualty event and you are having to deal with a whole range of issues with a limited amount of time and a limited amount of resources, and you have to prioritize things in terms of what is most important. And it's my sensibility that this masculinity crisis is a red alert crisis for the church that we need to pay a heavy attention to. And we have tended within the church to get sidetracked on men's leadership in the church, complementarity and egalitarianism, which is an important issue, biblically and otherwise. But it's completely beside the point on how we ground our identity in Christ in a way that transforms us, and how I know I can become like Jesus, in fact, a holy man. Now, let me make one quick caveat. I think you have to be careful whenever you talk in this space and one of the reasons people don't talk about this a lot is there's almost a kind of presumption that if you talk about what it means to be a holy man, that you're assuming that you already arrived. Mm. And I need to say very quickly, that is absolutely not the case. So I am like Paul in Ephesians, who says, I haven't arrived, but I press on to reach the purpose for which Christ called me. That is the space I'm in. But I do believe that we are given in Scripture a clear understanding of what it means to be a holy man, and we are not articulating it adequately for men so that they can say, oh, I see what I need to be working toward, and give them a vision of what is possible as a fully orbed man in the 21st century, reliant on Christ in a way that is beyond what anybody can imagine.
Well, I appreciate that. And I want to go to specifically the paper you wrote. You unpack that idea of a holy man, which I appreciate because Nancy Pearcey makes the distinction between good man versus real man. But I want to keep us upstream just a second on this idea of what it is to be a human, because I think that is the moment. And I just want everybody listening to again, to John's point, pay attention. We talk about these conversations. You hear a name like Elon Musk and you hear transhumanism and you hear AI and you're like, oh, okay, this is just, fodder for a podcast. And my point is, no, it's not. Like, our kids are literally being shaped by technology. And if you go back to Lewis's Abolition of Man, we're talking early 1900s, he's pointing forward to our day and saying, what's going to happen if we continue in the direction we're continuing? We're going to have men without chests. We're going to have people who have these particularized versions of themselves, enlarged minds, bloated bellies, but no spiritual center, no true understanding of what it is to be human. And John, you frame this with language of that men are experiencing an ontological insecurity, and they feel it. What do you mean by that? That idea of feeling ontologically insecure. You say those two words, we go, I don't even know what you mean, but those are important. That when I came across those words, I said, no, he's touching the thing that men are feeling. We don't have language for it. But that's why this crisis is so deep and penetrating, because there is an ontological insecurity. What do you mean by that?
Well, let's contrast it with psychological. I feel like I'm insecure. And that is a statement about my feelings and about me individually. Ontology is a study of reality. Where men are having trouble is they don't know how they fit within the real world in which they live. They're being told that what is most central to them, their identity as being biologically male, A, is not something we can talk about. B, doesn't exist, doesn't matter. And if it does matter, it's bad.
John, slow down. Hold on. Say those four things one more time. And I want you to say them really slow because, again, Riley's here, you're here, I'm here. We're all men. I've got a son. I'm raising a son. But the women who are listening, we have daughters, we have sons, we're raising kids, we're teachers. And what you just said, that difference, it's not just a feeling. There's ontology is just talking about reality. And what men are facing are these four things that are fundamental to what it is to breathe in and out air and go out on a recess and playground and say, who am I and what does it mean that I exist? What were those four things that you just rattled off?
Well, first is we can't talk about it. The cultural narrative is such that the problem is one of women. And we have in 1972, Title IX was created to deal with a 13-point gender gap of success between men and women, of which women at that point were 13 points behind men in every category. That difference is now expanded to 15%, except the roles are reversed. And now it's men below women in every category of life. Everything you measure as a social dysfunction, men are doing terribly. The greatest single variable of suicide is masculinity. In other words, in terms of graduation from college, across the board, loneliness, anything that is a social dysfunction, alcoholism, anything, graduation rates, anything, literacy, anything, men are in deep, deep trouble. Except in the cultural narrative, we can't talk about it because that's not what we talk about.
Which, before you go on to number two, thank you. I have to stand up for everybody in that and say, I'm a dad of 3 daughters, and I care deeply about the success and flourishing of my daughters. I care deeply about their opportunities and equality and doors opening, and yes to all of that. And I want them to be in good, healthy relationships in the world that they live in, whether that's vocationally or intimate relationships or whatever relationships they're going to be in. They're inevitably going to be in relationship with some men. And so a high calling for me as a dad of daughters is I look out at the landscape of men and say, they are deeply in trouble. And I don't necessarily want my daughter in intimate relationship with men who don't understand what it is to be a man. So sorry to get sidetracked, but when we say men's issue, by saying there's a men's issue, you've discounted a women's issue. I would say as a dad of daughters, I don't think so. It is a women's issue because we live in a world with each other.
No, that's right. And so the fact is that, marriage rates are way down. And part of it is men are largely unmarriageable. In other words, they're not worthy of being married to. And so it's a big problem. This is just a social problem that touches everything.
And so we can't talk about it.
We can't really talk about it. And then the second thing I believe I said was that the very notion of having a masculine gender is now a question. In other words, in the broader culture, if you say there are only 2 genders, you're probably in many circles subject to being canceled, because that is the notion is that gender is totally fluid and there is no such thing as a masculine gender. Now, historically speaking, every society has had a major cultural activity to affirm the male when he moved from being a boy to a man. Always been the case. And that's because masculinity in society is more fragile than femininity, which is intrinsically linked to biology. Most women are reminded of it on a monthly basis. They are intrinsically, their sense of being and feminine is linked more intrinsically to biology, whereas men, it's much more of a fragile social construct. Even though it is real, it is more fragile. And now we have simply erased it. So it's not only fragile, but it has been erased. So it's not something we can talk about. And now they're being told, no matter what you feel about yourself, it's not something that actually exists. Mm. And then we're told, third, but if it does exist, it's a fundamentally toxic problem. Now, that does not mean to say that there is not a lot of value in the Me Too movement and that men have been boorish and that we have been the source of a great deal of abuse. It's not to say that almost all of the mass shooters are men. It's not to say that we have, and we're the source of a great deal of violence. And 50% of all our marriages are collapsing. And in the 50% that are collapsing, probably 25% of the collapsing marriages have some kind of violence, emotional or otherwise, in them. In other words, and men are often the source of all of that. That's not to discount any of that. But we have basically said there's something intrinsic about you being male, if it does exist, that's toxic, that's a problem, and needs to be erased. So we are not able to talk about it. We erase its existence. And then if it does exist, it's a cosmic problem. Now, that means men who are trying to figure out who they are and how they function within the world have no idea how masculinity fits within reality, their reality, the reality with their friends, reality with the people they want to date, the reality of their jobs. They are in an ontological crisis. That is, they feel disconnected. And so there's a whole range of people who basically want to go back to traditional societies, to go back to animalistic patterns, to find some way to get traction in a time where everything, it's like you're on ice and you're skidding. At some point, men are just desperate to find traction somewhere. So they go to the Andrew Tates of the world to try to find somebody who will say it's okay to be a man.
I think, John, that's the point of that point number 3 of masculinity as a toxic expression. I think, right, again, as a dad of daughters, as a guy trying to raise sons and a friend of many, many, many good men, I think that there is a real humble and kind of grieving sense that, yeah, men have hurt a lot of people and a toxic vision of masculinity has been really, really bad. But as you said, the intrinsic nature of being male isn't that, and I can't escape that. Like, I wake up every day asking, okay, how can I not do that? How can I not contribute to that? How can I contribute in a more flourishing way to, this idea of shalom is a really biblical word, but universal flourishing and delight. And I want to be a part of that. I want to contribute, and I want to do it from who I was created to be, but there's no resource for that. And you're saying, okay, great, we've diagnosed the problem, so we can talk about it. So good, thank you. We can talk about it. Number 2, it is important to say that there's people waking up every day with a sense of identity that is rooted in this: I am created to be a man, and that is a real thing, and it's not something to be confused about or afraid of or to hate, but it is something to understand and to cultivate and to nurture, and that it doesn't have
And,
to.
and no, it doesn't have to be toxic at all. The fact of the matter is, uh, if God himself incarnates himself into creation as a man, it should be a sign that it's not intrinsically toxic.
Which even making
And
that state, even making
so
that
the
statement makes people cringe, because you go, well, did he have to? And you can just see you were afraid to even talk about the incarnation, because are we saying that it was particular, that it was specific, that there was a gender, that there was an embodiment? And we live in a
yes,
moment. You have a great quote that I have to read. Theologian John Crossan, I think you said that this is the way men are feeling. And I identified with this. It said, there is no lighthouse keeper. There is no lighthouse. There is no dry land. There are only people living on rafts made of their own imaginations. That triggered me back to Nietzsche. You know, we've wiped the horizon, unchained the earth from the sun, falling forward, backward. I think that's how men feel, and why when Nancy Pearcey says, okay, we can have this conversation, but we need to talk about good men versus real men, not the Andrew Tate version. We need to talk about what is a good man, not a real man, because we've been told, buck up. You use the word like grow a pair. There's these cultural things that like, okay, we're going to overcorrect, which takes us right back to toxic masculinity. You're advocating for something else. Nancy's advocating for something else. This good man or the holy man. Why did you choose that language, especially in our cultural moment, to say, as Nancy was saying, hey, there's a good man version and it is biblically rooted? You said, no, let's be explicit about that. There's an idea of a holy man.
well, you know, as a sociologist Peter Berger said, if God doesn't exist, any self is possible.
Hmm.
The fact of the matter is, our selfhood is linked intrinsically to God's existence. Just like a plant's life is linked intrinsically to the light of the sun. No sunlight, no life in a plant.
Hmm.
And if God doesn't exist, then my sense of self cannot exist. Now, so there are basically three approaches to identity. The modern one is my identity is designed. I design it myself, and on the basis of expressive individualism, I simply look within myself and find my authentic feelings, and then I find a way to articulate that with authenticity in my relationships with other people. The first move is down and it's individualistic, and that creates a fundamentally atomized society coupled with a extraordinary amount of hubris around autonomy. I create my own self. The second, which is the more modern version, was well, I discover my identity, and I discover it through some kind of test. Maybe it's Enneagram, maybe it's Myers Briggs, maybe it's a psychological personality profile, maybe it's a Minnesota multiphasic personality test. I took a personality test in college to discover which career path would be the best for me.
I'm dying to know
And
what
it
you got.
came back. So everything was flat, and then there was this really high mark, and then down. And so it was not like it was abstract. It was like clearly indicated where I should be. Funeral parlor director.
Okay.
I do well with dead people. Anyway, or people in grief. Anyway, the point being is, I didn't follow that. But the fact is that there's this notion that we can take tests and discover who we are. Enneagram is a common one people use today. Now, the biblical understanding of that is our identity is derived out of an ongoing relationship. Our identity is never fixed. I get there and I arrive. No, my identity is based on the dynamic of my relationship with God in real time right now. And who God says I am in real time right now. It's not what other people say about me, it's what God says about me, and it's about Him living out His life in and through me. I can only be who I am if, in fact, my life is re-enchanted by the dynamic of a mystical relationship of Christ's indwelling presence in my life. And that's why I don't think a good man, which takes you to virtue and character, quite gets at the mystical and spiritual. In other words, it'll get you to the Greeks, but it won't get you to Jesus. My point is we need to be in an indwelling mystical relationship with God where He is empowering us in a manner that enables me to be fully who I am. And that takes us to the conversation of holy, meaning there's something beyond myself that is I am on which my life is fundamentally dependent and which I need to be reminded of on a daily basis. And I need to live my life in such a way that I have disciplines and rituals in my life such that I live out of the reminding presence of God's being, that I am that dependent on God on a daily basis.
I think what I love that you did there is with the distinction between good man and holy man going again upstream to the source. Because as Lewis said, if you aim at first things, you get second things. And I think if you aim at a holy man, and the vision is Jesus, the incarnational, the new creation, the new Adam, if that's the aim, which is what biblically the vision of what it is to be a human person is flowing from that, if we are deriving our identity from that source, downstream of that, you get good men. And you get true, you get beautiful, you get all of the virtues, you get the classics, all that is thrown in, it's all downstream of that. But it goes back to an ontological reality that says, what is our source? What is our starting point? Who is upstream? What's beyond? And is that beyond a creator who creates creatures that have an image-bearing incarnational sense that's not just mental or emotional, but it's an embodied reality. And that's got to be the starting point.
You can't start with in if you don't start with out.
Yeah, 100%. And we would say you have to start up with a transcendent.
Start up, and then it's got to be transformed within, and then the fruit happens.
True.
The fact of the matter is, on almost all of our conversations, we're not pushing it to the deepest spiritual level. And that's why I think even the word shalom, which you mentioned earlier, it's a rich word, and it is a word that comes out of the Judeo-Christian background, but it's fundamentally a horizontal word. Being at peace, even flourishing, has a this worldly horizontal dynamic. Whereas I think what we're pushing toward is re-enchantment, which is immediately puts it in the context of modernity and disenchantment of modernity, immediately alerts people to the fact that there's something deeply spiritual, maybe even mystical, involved in this conversation. And what we need is men who are re-enchanted back to their core identity, rooted in the reality of the indwelling presence of Christ in their life. And so I'm pushing for men to, to be more mystical, more disciplined, and more influential.
Well, I know that we've got to watch our time and I want to respect your time. So here's what we'll do. We're going to put a comma on the conversation because you outlined 7 points, and I don't know if those are going to turn into a book or a work, but you go to the detail level of a holy man. And so maybe we'll pause and we'll do a second conversation downstream, particularly around that. Today, I'm just grateful that you're willing to have the conversation and that you have the courage to step into it. Nancy said it's the most controversial book she's ever written, and she's
Yes.
never faced the controversy or the pushback that she got publishing this book because
And the
she
controversy she's facing is the fact that she's thinking that there is something positive about masculinity and that something like masculinity actually exists.
well, in the challenge she faced, she's
I'm assuming all of that and saying yes, and how we empower the masculinity exists so that it actually looks like what it should be and isn't toxic is by keeping our focus on Jesus and letting our lives become little Christ
I think that's
by indwelling presence of Christ within us. So I think I'm glad she's taking the heat for the work she's done. I'm just trying to raise these stakes one level more. Now, people can be critical, and maybe some men may say, well, I don't see how that's actually possible, but I'm going to try to answer to. And I didn't actually put them in categories. I mean, first, there's a whole set of them that have to do with the kind of person you are. And then there's a whole nother set of them that have to do with the kind of tools that you need to use. And then there's another set that deals with what is the production that comes out. If you need to be a certain kind of handyman who uses a certain kind of tools that builds a certain kind of building. And I, discuss those. But what I did not discuss in the paper was on each of those things, how do you make that actualized in your life? How do you actually demonstrate and make that a real part of your daily life so that you become that kind of person? In other words, again, I told you that I don't think I've arrived. In fact, I read over this list of things about a holy man on a daily basis as a way to call myself to those goals. It's not like and the fact is, by definition, I've said you never arrive because your identity is only as good as it is in real time, in real relationship with God today. So on the internet today, there is a major article about John Seel saying that one of the books I wrote is the worst book he has ever read in his life and that I'm an idiot. That's the exact quote. John Seel is an idiot. And it's the worst book he's ever read in his entire life. Now, I was alerted to that just before this podcast. And I took that as from the Lord to remind me, you're going to be talking about identity. And let me remind you, it has nothing to do with what other people say. And if you put yourself out there by writing books or writing papers, A, you could be wrong. And often you will be wrong. And B, you'll be criticized. And you put yourself out there for strong critique. And the fact is, you may deserve it, you may not deserve it, but at some level, it doesn't matter. Why? Because what matters is who I say you are, and it is not the power you get from clicks that empowers you. It's the power you get from dependence on me that empowers you. And so it was a healthy reminder and a check on my spirit to say, today, what's going to shape your identity? Me or what this person said on the internet.
John, I think that's what's so poignant about the conversation. As a dad, again, I wake up and that's the reality our kids are facing is, who am I? Is it the person who likes or doesn't like what I just posted? And is it the affirmation I'm receiving externally from me, and whose voice is that? So here's my hope. My hope is everybody listening, this conversation can touch philosophy and theology and incredibly complex terms like ontology and trying to figure out what it is to be a human. It can feel overwhelming. Here's what I want everybody to leave with is, if you feel a little bit exhausted and a little bit weary and you wonder what that aching sense is, that I feel a sense of dislocation, you're not wrong. And it's okay to feel that way. Right now is an incredibly difficult moment to understand, what does it mean to be human? And to be a parent, to be a kid, to be a teacher, to say what does it mean to shape really wonderful young men and women? What does it mean to be a good man, a godly man, a holy man, a godly woman? These are the conversations that matter. And so thanks for listening, everybody who's participating in the conversation. And what we want to do is, I'm going to leave it here and just say, we're going to keep pulling on this thread. We're grateful for Dr. Pearcey, grateful for Dr. Seel, and we're going to keep this conversation going. And for everybody who's listening, just thanks for joining the conversation and continuing to walk it out, because I just want to recognize it's wearisome. Everybody we talk to is going, there's a sense of exhaustion of even what it means. And we've talked about it so many times, the crisis of meaning. So, John, thanks for that. Thanks for joining us for the conversation. Remember to like and subscribe to Lab the Podcast, and visit vuvivo.com to help us uncover enchanted reality. We'll see you next time.